She left a note on the kitchen counter that morning. Not a goodbye note, just a grocery list. Milk, eggs, bread. The handwriting of an 18-year-old girl who fully expected to be standing in that same kitchen before dinner, humming to whatever song was stuck in her head that week, maybe already thinking about what she'd make with those eggs. Kelly Brooks never came home. And for 12 years, that grocery list sat in a drawer in her parents' house in Lander, Wyoming, because her mother couldn't bring herself to throw it away, and her father couldn't bring himself to look at it. Two people in the same house, carrying the same grief in completely opposite directions, held together by a scrap of paper that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Today we're going to talk about what really happened on that mountain. About 12 years of silence so complete, it felt like the answer had died along with the question. About a man who sat in church pews and shook hands at fundraisers and donated money to the very memorial fund built in the name of the girl he had killed, and who said nothing for over a decade, not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. And we're going to talk about what happens when a dying man, staring at a ceiling in a hospital room 3 counties away, finally decides that some secrets are too heavy to carry into whatever comes next. Because here is what this case ultimately proved. The earth keeps the secrets men bury, but it doesn't keep them forever. August 14th, 2014 was a Thursday. The kind of Wyoming summer morning that looks like something a painter invented. Sky so blue it seems almost artificial, air sharp with pine resin, the Wind River Range stretched out along the horizon like a giant sleeping thing that has always been there and always will be. Kelly Brooks, 18 years old, laced up her hiking boots that morning the same way she had done 100 times before. She kissed her mother on the cheek. She grabbed her pack, which she had loaded the night before, because that was the kind of hiker she was, prepared, methodical, unhurried. She told her parents she'd be back by sunset. That point, the kind of hiker she was, matters more than it might seem right now. Keep it in your mind. Kelly had been navigating the trails of Shoshone National Forest since she was 8 years old. These were not unfamiliar mountains to her. She knew the elevation changes, the weather patterns that rolled in from the west, the shortcuts that cut time off the longer loops, the creek crossings that were manageable in summer, but treacherous in spring runoff. She carried a map, a compass, emergency supplies, water. She was a standout athlete at her high school, the kind of physical conditioning that matters when terrain turns unexpected. Her parents were teachers, themselves outdoors people, the kind of family that had passed down a relationship with the natural world the way other families pass down recipes or Sunday rituals. Kelly had college orientation papers filled out and sitting on her desk, ready to be mailed the following week. She was not a girl in crisis. She was not a girl looking for an escape. She was a girl who had a Tuesday afternoon and a trail she loved, and every reason in the world to expect an ordinary day. By midnight on August 14th, every light in the Brooks house was burning. Kelly had not called. Her phone went directly to voicemail. Her parents drove to the trailhead where her car was parked, engine cold, keys inside, exactly where she'd left it, and stood in the dark while the forest made its sounds, none of which with their daughter's voice coming through the trees. They stood there long enough that the cold started to matter, and then they went back and made the call that every parent prays they will never have to make. The search that followed was one of the largest in Fremont County history. Volunteers arrived within hours of the missing persons report, hundreds of them by morning, moving in organized grids across terrain that complicated everything. Sheriff's deputies from 3 surrounding counties, helicopters sweeping the ridge lines at first light, search and rescue teams with dogs trained specifically to find human scent in high-altitude conditions, where elevation changes and shifting wind patterns can carry a smell miles from its source or bury it entirely beneath the mineral cold of the rock. For weeks, the mountains above Lander were alive with radio calls and whistle signals and the slow, methodical sound of boots moving through underbrush. They found nothing. Not a dropped water bottle. Not a piece of clothing caught on a branch. Not a single footprint beyond the trailhead parking area. No evidence of a fall. No evidence of an animal encounter. No evidence of a struggle, a medical event, a sudden weather crisis. Kelly's phone had sent one signal, a ping to a cell tower near the trailhead at 10:15 in the morning, and then gone completely silent. As if she had walked to the edge of something and simply stepped off. The absence of evidence is supposed to tell investigators something, but in terrain as vast and geologically complex as the Wind River Range, where a single square mile can hide 1,000 secrets under layers of pine needles and granite and the accumulated debris of decades, the absence of evidence can also just mean you don't have enough eyes, and the space is too large, and the thing you're looking for doesn't want to be found. Or, more precisely, the person who put it there didn't want it to be found. Because here is what nobody understood in 2014, what the investigators couldn't see, and the volunteers couldn't know, and the community couldn't conceive of as they moved through their grief. Kelly Brooks was not on that mountain. She had never made it past the trailhead. If this case is already unsettling you, and I promise it gets significantly darker from here, you already know what to do. The theories multiplied in the first year the way they always do when evidence refuses to materialize. The wilderness hypothesis, catastrophic fall into a remote ravine, a location so inaccessible the search teams simply hadn't reached it, seemed most plausible at first, and it wasn't unreasonable. The Wind River Range had claimed experienced hikers before, but the absence of any physical trace, even in the areas that were searched, began to feel less like bad luck and more like something deliberate as the months accumulated. The mental health angle was examined and dismissed quickly. Kelly's friends, teachers, coaches, and family all described a young woman who was genuinely excited about her future, not fleeing from it. Foul play became the whispered theory somewhere in year 2, spoken carefully, in low voices, because in a small town like Lander, saying foul play out loud means pointing at someone, and pointing at someone in a community where everyone knows everyone is an act with consequences. Nobody pointed, and the man who knew exactly what had happened continued to attend community events and nod at funerals and express condolences with the practiced ease of someone who had decided very deliberately that the safest place to hide was not the shadows. It was the center. The first winter after Kelly disappeared, her mother kept the porch light on every night. Not as a symbol, not as a gesture for a news camera. Sharon Brooks kept that porch light burning because she needed Kelly to be able to find her way home in the dark if she came back. Think about what that takes. Think about what a parent has to believe, what they have to refuse to stop believing, to sustain that kind of vigil through a Wyoming winter, and then another winter, and then another. The Brooks family never filed to have Kelly declared legally dead, which families sometimes do after years without answers, partly for legal and financial reasons, partly because the declaration provides a form of closure that continued uncertainty makes impossible. The Brooks family didn't want that form of closure. They wanted a different one. They kept the tip line active. They gave interviews on every anniversary. They continued to follow up with investigators, even as the personnel assigned to the case cycled out, retired, transferred, moved on to other things. They drove to the trailhead every August 14th and left wildflowers at the small wooden memorial they had built in the first year. And over time, other people in Lander began joining them, quietly, without announcement, the way a community makes ritual out of grief it doesn't know how to resolve. They watched Kelly's friends graduate college, get married, have children, build the shape of adult lives in all the directions a life is supposed to go. And they kept waiting. The file on Kelly Brooks grew thick. Leads came in and dissolved. Persons of interest were identified, interviewed, cleared. The digital evidence from her phone was analyzed in 2014 using the tools available at the time, which could establish that her device had communicated with a tower near the trailhead at 10:15 a.m., and nothing more. The granular data, the passive pings, the fragmented cellular metadata embedded in archived tower logs that her phone and every other phone in that area had been generating all morning. That level of forensic reconstruction simply wasn't possible for a local law enforcement agency in 2014. The technology existed in pieces, in research papers, in the developing edge of what digital forensics could theoretically do. But the practical tools to apply it to a cold case in Wyoming hadn't arrived yet. That detail will matter enormously. Hold on to it. 12 years is a long time to carry a secret. It turns out it is also, for some people, exactly as long as a conscience can be held underwater before it forces itself to the surface. In early 2026, a man was admitted to a hospital in a county 3 hours east of Lander. He was not a central figure in the story of Kelly Brooks, not someone the investigation had ever focused on, not a name that appeared prominently in the case file. He was a peripheral figure, an associate of a well-established local businessman, someone who had moved in the same social geography as the Lander community for years without ever being at its center. He was dying, and in the particular arithmetic that happens at the end of a life, when you were lying in a bed taking inventory of what you did and what you permitted and what you stayed silent about, he found that what he knew was heavier than he could carry into whatever came next. He asked to speak to a detective. What he said in that hospital room was brief, specific, and it was the first real fracture in the ice of a case that had been frozen solid for 12 years. His statement didn't point toward a stranger. It didn't describe a transient who had passed through Lander and disappeared. It pointed inward, toward someone whose name was known in that community, whose face was familiar at local events, whose presence at the search parties in August 2014 had been documented and recorded and never once flagged as anything other than a concerned neighbor helping look for a missing girl. It pointed toward a man who had donated money to Kelly's memorial fund. Sit with that for a moment, because this is the part that doesn't get easier with repetition. Not a monster in the shadows, not a stranger who slipped through and vanished. A person with standing, with a reputation, with enough social capital that suspicion would have felt almost offensive. The kind of person a community instinctively protects without realizing it's doing so. Because people like that don't fit the shape of what we imagine guilt looks like. He had not fled. He had not disappeared. He had stayed and participated and watched and performed grief and community solidarity with sufficient precision that no one had looked at him sideways for 12 years. The community itself had become his camouflage. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now, because I want to know. Did you suspect someone like this, or were you looking somewhere else? Stay with me. The next part is where 12 years of patience finally pays off. The detectives who received the dying man's statement were not the same investigators who had worked the original case. Most of those officers had retired or moved on. But the case had never officially closed. The Brooks family had made sure of that, through every phone call and follow-up and anniversary interview. And when fresh information arrived, it landed on the desk of a newer generation of investigators who had something their predecessors in 2014 simply didn't have. 12 additional years of technological development in digital forensics. In 2014, the cellular data from the trailhead area had been analyzed and found inconclusive. One ping. End of story. But the science surrounding cellular metadata had transformed in the intervening years. By 2026, forensic analysts could access what has been described as residual or passive cellular data, fragmented signals and metadata that devices broadcast continuously even when not making active calls or sending messages. Information that older systems had collected but never been able to interpret, sitting in archived tower logs, like words written in a language no one had learned to read yet. The data hadn't been deleted. It had simply been waiting for someone to ask the right question with the right tools. This time, investigators weren't just mapping Kelly's last known position. They were mapping everyone's. Cross-referencing the reconstructed digital picture of who had been near that trailhead on the morning of August 14, 2014, with the specific geographic details provided by the dying man's statement, a pattern emerged that had never appeared in the original investigation. A device, not Kelly's, in close proximity to the trailhead during the window in question. A device that then moved, not deeper into the Shoshone National Forest, but away from it, toward a parcel of private land, held under a business name, sitting in a section of terrain that had been adjacent to the official 2014 search area, but never entered by investigators. Because its owner had cooperated early in the original investigation, expressed appropriate concern, given an interview, and never once done anything to draw the kind of attention that would have led anyone to look at what he owned and where it was. The property belonged to the man whose name had just been spoken in a hospital room 3 hours away. The forensic team arrived at the parcel with ground-penetrating radar, a technology that works in silence, that you don't hear operating, that requires only a technician moving slowly across the earth, watching a screen read the shapes and densities of what lies beneath the surface. It finds what the ground has decided to keep. The team moved across that land with the particular weight of people who understood what they were looking for and what it would mean if they found it. Beneath the root system of an ancient pine tree, in a location that had clearly been selected for its concealment, chosen by someone who knew this land well enough to know that the roots would resist disturbance, that the tree itself would draw no attention from the air, that the location sat in the precise gap between where search teams had gone and where they hadn't. The radar showed what it showed. I want you to understand what that moment was. 12 years. A family counting time not in years, but in individual days. Each one the same question, the same absence. A porch light that burned through Wyoming winters, a grocery list that couldn't be thrown away, a memorial at a trailhead that a community visited every August, and a piece of equipment rolling across private land, finally reading the answer that had been buried under everyone's feet the entire time. The remains were recovered. Forensic testing confirmed with certainty that they belonged to Kelly Brooks. She had been there since 2014, not on the mountain, not in some remote ravine that search teams had missed. 3 counties from where her car had been found, 3 counties from the trailhead memorial, 3 counties from the porch light her mother had kept burning for years in case Kelly needed to find her way home in the dark. The evidence recovered at the site did not suggest an accident. It did not suggest a fall, or a medical event, or any of the wilderness scenarios that had been theorized and re-theorized for over a decade. The manner of concealment was methodical, calculated, the act of someone who understood how searches worked, who had reason to know that investigators would focus on the national forest, would follow the trail of her last phone ping, would look up at the mountains rather than across at the private land below. Someone who had used that knowledge, and their access to this specific location, and their social standing in the community, as a 3-part system of protection that had worked for 12 years. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning in March 2026. No dramatic standoff, no public unraveling caught on camera, just the quiet procedural click of handcuffs on the wrists of a man the town of Lander had known for decades. A man whose name appeared on a donor plaque in a community center, who had shaken hands at fundraisers, who had sat in church pews and listened to prayers for the safe return of a girl he knew would never return. Handcuffs on a man who had, at various points over 12 years, expressed sympathy to people who were grieving the girl he had killed, and who had done so with enough apparent sincerity that no one had ever thought to doubt him. The shockwave that moved through Lander after the arrest was not the explosive kind. It was the slow, seismic kind, the pressure through bedrock kind that you feel in your stomach before you understand it in your mind. People who had known this man began the disorienting work of going back through their memories and trying to locate the moment where they should have seen it. Most found nothing because he had given them nothing to find. That is the nature of this kind of person. They don't hide in the margins. They stand in the center. They use the community's own trust as the thing that makes them invisible. Forensic psychologists who study this behavioral pattern, the perpetrator who stays, who participates, who performs normalcy with precision, will tell you that it is not as rare as we would like to believe. It requires a particular psychological architecture, the ability to compartmentalize completely, to maintain a social performance indefinitely, to calculate that flight creates suspicion, while presence creates cover. The community becomes the alibi. The longer you remain without being suspected, the more your continued presence is read as evidence of innocence. It is a terrible logic, and it works. And it worked here for 12 years. The legal proceedings that followed were still unfolding at the time of this account, as the full apparatus of a Wyoming courtroom assembled the digital forensic evidence, the findings from the recovery site, and the testimony of the informant whose conscience had, in the end, spoken louder than his loyalty to a man he had protected with his silence for over a decade. The informant was not a hero. He had known something for years, and he had chosen not to speak, and the Brooks family had lived through 4,200 days of not knowing because of that choice. But in the end, he made a different choice. In a hospital bed, in the last accounting of a life, when the weight of what he knew became heavier than whatever had kept it submerged. 4,200 days. That is how Kelly's family counted it when they released their statement in the week following the arrest. Not 12 years, 4,200 days. Because that is how grief actually measures time, not in the clean page turns of calendar years, but in individual days that stack on top of each other, each one identical in its central absence, each one another unit of the same question without an answer. They said they had watched Kelly's friends build lives. They said they had never stopped because they had made a promise to Kelly, and they had kept it. They said the relief they felt, and they were careful to call it relief, not happiness, not closure, because those words didn't fit, was not clean or simple. It was the kind of relief that comes wrapped in everything you still cannot change, in the permanent, unalterable fact that Kelly would not be coming home the way they had always meant that phrase. But she was coming home. She was leaving that private land and returning to them. And that, they said, mattered in a way they couldn't fully translate into words. They thanked the investigator who had agreed to reopen the case. They thanked the forensic teams. And then, quietly, without elaboration, with what sounded in the written statement like a complicated and specifically weighted kind of acknowledgement, they thanked the man who had come forward in that hospital room. Because whatever his reasons, whatever his timing, whatever his years of silence had cost them, he had given them the one thing that 12 years of searching had not been able to produce: a name, a location, the truth. There is a lesson buried inside this case, buried as deliberately as Kelly was and considerably harder to excavate. It is a lesson about the difference between being seen and being known. The community of Landers saw the perpetrator clearly. They interacted with him over years. They included him in their events and their grief and their rituals of community life. They believed they knew him. But what they knew was a performance, a social construction maintained with enough precision and sustained with enough patience that the town's own familiarity with him became the thing that prevented anyone from looking too closely. In the specific geography of a small community, where familiarity generates a particular form of trust, and that trust generates a particular form of blindness, that performance held for 12 years. Ask yourself, how well do you actually know the people around you? Not how often you see them, not how warmly you feel toward them, but how much of what you know is what they have chosen to let you see. Kelly Brooks was 18 years old. She loved the trails of Shoshone National Forest with a particular, bone-deep familiarity of someone who had grown up in their presence. She was a standout athlete, the daughter of 2 teachers, a girl who loaded her pack the night before a hike because she was prepared and careful and serious about the mountains she trusted with her footsteps. She left a grocery list on the kitchen counter the morning she disappeared. She had college orientation papers ready to mail. She told her parents she'd be home by sunset, because she always was, because she was that kind of hiker, in those kinds of mountains, on a clear summer Thursday when the sky made everything look safe. She deserved to come home. And the Wyoming courtroom that is now processing the evidence, assembling the testimony, grinding through the formal machinery of accountability, it is doing something that took 4,200 days to reach, but that was always, in some form, coming. Because here is what Kelly's case insists, in its long and terrible patience. Time is not always the enemy of truth. Sometimes it is the mechanism. Technologies evolve. Witnesses age and recalculate. The silence becomes too heavy to carry, and the earth, which keeps the secrets men bury in it, does not keep them forever. The mystery is over. What lives now in its place is something harder and more necessary. Leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this case stayed with you most, because there are layers here that I think people are going to be processing for a long time. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell, because the next case we're covering starts with a single voicemail, left by a woman who, by the time anyone listened to it, was already gone. And I promise you, the truth got out on that one too.